In this talk about business architecture as part of TOGAF ADM life cycle. In general, a knowledge of business architecture is a prerequisite for architectural work in any other domains such as data, application, and technology, and is therefore the most architectural activities that need to be undertaken is not created for already in other organizational processes such as enterprise planning, strategic business planning, or process re-engineering, etc. In practical terms, the business architecture is also often necessary as a means of demonstrating the business value of subsequent architectural works to key stakeholders, and the returns of investment to those stakeholders from supporting the from supporting and participating in the subsequent work. The objectives of phase B, which is the business architecture phase, are in 2 points, can be described in 2 points. One is to develop the target business architecture that describes how the enterprise needs to operate to achieve the business goals and respond to the strategic drivers set out in the architectural vision in a way that addresses the request for architectural work and stakeholder concerns. The other point is to identify the candidate architecture roadmap components based upon a gap between the baseline and the target business architecture. In order to achieve that, we have an approach, so we need to undertake an approach. The scope of the work in business, phase B, will depend to a large extent on the enterprise environment itself. In some cases, key elements of the business architecture may be done in other activities. For example, the enterprise mission, vision, enterprise strategy or goals may be documented as part of some wider business strategies or enterprise planning activities that has its own life cycle within the enterprise. In other cases, little or no business architecture work may have been done to date. In such a case, there will be a need for an architectural team to research and verify and gain to buy in the key business objectives and processes that the architecture is to support. In both of these cases, the business scenario technology or techniques of TOGAF ADM or any other method that illuminates the key business requirements and indicates the implied technical requirements for IT architecture may be used. The other approach or the other part of our approach is about gathering and analyzing only the information that allows informed decisions to be made relevant to the scope of the architectural efforts. If this effort is focused on the definition of business processes Then phase B will necessarily involve a lot of detailed work. If the focus is more on the target architecture in other domains to support an essential existing business architecture, then it is important to build a complete picture in phase B without going into unnecessary details. One of the important aspects of our approach is to develop a baseline description. If an enterprise has existing architecture descriptions, they should be used as the baseline, description. And this input may have been used already in phase A in developing the architectural vision, and may even be sufficient in itself for the baseline description. If there is no such description exists, information will have to be gathered in whether whatever format comes handy, or in different formats, whatever is the standard for the organization. The normal approach to target architectural development is top-down. In the baseline description, however, the analysis of the current state often has to be done bottom-up, particularly with little or no architectural assets exist. In such a case, the architect simply has to document the working assumptions about high-level architecture, and the process is one of the gathering and evidence to turn the working assumptions into facts until the law of diminishing returns set up. Whatever the approach, the goal should be to reuse existing materials as much as possible, and to gather and analyze only that information that allows informed decisions to be made regarding the target business architecture. It is important to build a complete picture without going into unnecessary details. As part of our approach, we need to also consider business modeling. Business modeling should be logically or should be a logical extension of the business scenarios from architectural vision in phase A, so that the architecture can be mapped from a high-level business requirement down to the more detailed ones. A variety of modeling tools and techniques can be used or employed if deemed appropriate. For example, we can do activity modeling that to describe the functions associated with the enterprise business activities, and the data information exchange between activities, and the data and information exchange with other activities that are outside the scope of the model. We can use use case models that can describe either business processes or system functions depending on the focus of the modeling effort. A use case model describes usually the business processes of an enterprise in terms of use case and actors corresponding to the business processes and organizational participants. And another modeling tool we can use is the class models sometimes. They're similar to logical data models. Usually a class model describes a static information and relationships between information. A class model also describes information behavior. Like many of the other models, it can also be used to model various levels of granularity as well. So depending on which level of view would you like to have, you can have different levels of details. Depending on the intent of the model, a class diagram or class model can represent business domain entities or system implementation classes. It doesn't really necessarily mean you need to have actual, Java or C++ code. It could be a business domain entity relationship. A business domain model represents a key business information and their characteristics and their behaviors and their relationships and cardinality of those entities. All three types of these type of model that we described right now can be represented on a unified modeling language, UML, and a variety of tools exist that they can support that. We can also create models such as node connectivity diagram, which describes the business location from a network point of view. A node can represent an organizational unit or a business as well, not necessarily a information technology network. It could be a business network or business entity network. We can also use things such as the information exchange matrix that documents the information exchange requirements for an enterprise architecture. These information exchange requirements express the relationships across three basic entities: activities, business nodes, and their elements and information flow. And it focuses on characteristics of an information exchange such as performance and security and so on. And they identify who exchanges what kind of information with whom, why the information is necessary, and in what manner is. As part of information business architecture, we need to look at the inputs of this phase. Business architecture inputs defines the inputs of the phase B. And we can describe it in three main inputs to the business architecture. The first one is reference materials external to the enterprise. Just like other enterprises, architecture reference methods or materials or the architecture repository acts as the holding area for all architectural related projects within the enterprise. And the repository allows projects to manage their deliverables and locate reusable assets and publish outputs of stakeholders and other interested entities. And so it's basically a repository of material that it could be employed that are outside the enterprise itself. The second type of input is called non-architectural inputs. These are in 4 different formats. First is the request for architectural work. This is a document that is sent from sponsoring organizations or sections within the organization to the architectural organization to trigger the start of an architectural development cycle. Requests for architectural work can be created as an output of the preliminary phase. A result of approved architectural change request or terms of reference for architectural work originating from migrating planning. Second type is business principles, business goals, and business drivers. These provide context for architectural work by describing the needs and ways of working employed by the enterprise. Many factors that lay outside the consideration of architectural discipline may nevertheless be or have significantly impacted implications for the way that architecture is developed. The other type is the capability assessment. Is about what is the capability level of the enterprise as a whole. Where does the enterprise wish to increase or optimize its capability? Or what are the architectural focus areas that will support the desired development of the enterprise? It is also about what is the capability or maturity level of the IT function within the enterprise. And it's answering the question of what are the likely implications of conducting the architectural project in terms or design governance, operational governance, skills, and organizational structure. It is also about what is the capability and maturity of the architectural function within the enterprise. And it needs to answer why or what architectural assets are currently in existence, or what is it we have currently, and are they maintained and accurate, or they're outdated? What standards and reference models need to be considered, and are they likely to be opportunities to create reusable assets during the architectural project? We are also need to answer the question of where capability gaps exists between between what we mentioned, existing baseline, and the future goal or future view of the enterprise. To what extent is the business ready to transform in order to reach the goal capability, target capability? What are the risks to transformation culture barriers and other considerations to be addressed beyond the base capability gap? And we also talk about architectural input in terms of architectural organizational models for enterprise architecture. Those include scope of the organization or scope of the organizational impact. It's about maturity assessment, gaps and resolution approach. Organizational model for enterprise architecture is also about roles and responsibilities for architectural teams. It is also about constraints on architectural work, budget requirements, and governance and support strategies. Second point is the tailored architectural framework. That is also about tailored architectural methods, tailored architectural contents, such as deliverables and artifacts, and also about the configured and deployed tools or deployment tools. Next point is about approved statement of architectural work. We also need to have architectural principles, including business principles, and whenever they pre-exist or whenever they are handy. We are also talking about enterprise continuum in this input. So we need to have enterprise continuum as part of our input that can provide us with pre-existing capabilities or pre-existing models and building blocks. We talk about architectural repository in terms of reusable building block components, publicly available reference models from other organizations or from different levels of granularity, organizational specific reference models, organizational standards, and so on. The other point is architectural vision. In architectural vision, we are concerned about the problem description, objectives of statement of architectural work, summary views, business scenarios sometimes, or refined key high-level stakeholder requirements. And finally, we're concerned about draft architectural definition document that includes baseline for business architecture, technology architecture, data architecture, and application architecture, as well as targets for business architecture, technology architecture, data architecture, and application architecture. Okay, so these are the inputs for business architectural activity in this phase. Now let's say what are the steps we need to take in order to get this done. The level of details addressed in phase B will depend on the scope and the goal of the overall architecture efforts. New business processes being introduced as part of or as part of this effort will need to be defined in detail during business, phase B, this phase. Existing business processes to be carried over and supported in the target environment may already have been adequately defined in previous architectural works, but if not, they too will need to be defined in phase B. So therefore, we can actually put this in nine sequential steps, beginning with the selection or selecting reference models and viewpoints and tools. To do that, we determine overall modeling process. For each viewpoint, select models needed to support a specific view required using the selected tool or model. Ensure that all stakeholders concerned are covered. And activity models, use case models and class models are mentioned earlier as techniques to enable the definition of an organizational business architecture. In many cases, all three approaches can be utilized in sequence to progressively decompose a business or show the decomposition of a particular business within the organization. To do that, we can use things like structured analysis to identify the key business functions within the scope of the architecture. You can use case analysis that breaks down, it's a breakdown of business level functionality across actors and organization, allowed the actors to, actors in a function to be identified. And also process modeling, that is a breakdown of a function or business service through process modeling that allows the elements of the process to be identified. Second type is to identify required service granularity level or boundaries and contracts in order to allow the architect flexibility to define business services at the level of granularity that is appropriate for management by the business. The functions are split as follows, such as micro level functions and macro level functions that define the boundaries. And the business architecture phase therefore need to identify which components of the architecture are functions and which are services. Services are distinguished from function through the explicit definition of a service contract. Next point, the third point, is to identify required catalog of business building blocks. Catalogs capture inventories of core assets of the business. And those catalogs we can mention are catalogs such as organization actor catalog, drivers, goals, objectives catalog, role catalog, business service or function catalog, location catalog, process, event, control, product catalog, contract and measures catalog. Point 4 is talking about identifying requirement matrices. Matrix show the core relationships between related model entities, and matrices from the raw material for developing, they form a raw material for developing or development of views and also act as a key resource for impact assessment. We can mention two types of matrix, such as business interaction matrix that shows dependency and communication between organization and actors. Also, we can mention actor role matrix that shows the roles undertaken by each actor. Point 5 tells us about identifying required diagrams. Diagrams such as business footprint diagram, business service diagram, function decomposition diagram, goal objective service diagram, use case diagram, organization decomposition diagram, process flow diagram, and events diagram. And point 6 is about identify types of requirement to be collected. The requirements are such as relates to the business domain, provide requirements input into data application and technology architectures, and to provide detailed guidelines or guidance to be reflected during the design and implementation of or design and implementation to ensure that the solution addresses the original architectural requirements. Okay, the step 2, we get to step 2 to develop baseline business architecture description. We develop a baseline description of existing business architecture to the extent necessary to the support or for the support in the target business architecture. The scope and the level of details to be defined will depend on the extent to which existing business elements are likely to be carried over into the target business architecture. Point 3 or step 3 is about developing a target business architecture description. To do so, we develop a target description for the business architecture to the extent necessary to support a architecture vision. Point 4 or step 4 is to perform a gap analysis. We are to verify the architectural models for internal consistency and accuracy by performing trade-off analysis to resolve conflicts among the different views, validity or validating that the model support the principles, objectives, and constraints. We note that changes to the viewpoint represented in the selected model from the architecture repository and document, and test architecture models for completeness against the requirements. Step 5 is to define the candidate roadmap components. Following creation of the baseline architecture, target architecture, and the gap analysis results, a business roadmap is required to prioritize activities over the coming phase. This initial business architecture roadmap will be used as raw material to support more detailed definition of the consolidated cross-disciplinary roadmap. Step 6 is to resolve impacts across the architectural landscape. At this stage, other architectural artifacts in the architectural landscape should be examined to identify things such as does this business architecture create an impact on any pre-existing architecture? Have recent changes been made that impact on the business architecture? Are there any opportunities to leverage work from this business architecture in other areas of the organization? And does this business architecture impact other projects? And will this business architecture be impacted by other projects, vice versa? Step 7 is to conduct formal stakeholder review. Check the organizational motivation for the architectural project and the statement of architectural work against the proposed business architecture. Step 8 is to finalize the business architecture. We select standards for each of the building blocks, reusing as much as possible from the reference model selected from the architectural repository. Fully document each building block. Conduct a final cross check of overall architecture against business goals. Document final requirements. Traceability report. Document final mapping of the architecture within the architectural repository. Step 9 is to create the architectural definition document. Document rationale for building block decisions in the architectural definition document. Prepare the business sections of the architectural definition document, comprising a business footprint, a detailed description of business function and their information needs, a management footprint, standards, rules and guidelines showing working practices, logistics, legislations, financial measures, etc. A skill matrix and set of job descriptions. And after carrying all these steps, we need to have the outputs as follows. Redefine and updated versions of the architectural vision phase, deliverables where applicable, including the statement of architectural work. A statement of architectural work defines the scope and approach that will be used to complete an architectural development cycle. Validate business principles, business goals, and business drivers. These provide context for architectural work by describing the needs and ways of working employed by the enterprise. Another output is the architectural principles. These are general rules and guidelines intended to be enduring and seldom amended, that inform and supports the way in which the organization sets about fulfilling its mission. In their turn, principles may be just one element in a structured set of ideas that collectively define and guide the organization from values through to actions and results. For that, we need a draft architectural definition document that includes a baseline business architecture, if appropriate. It includes a target business architecture that in turn includes the organizational structure, business goals and objectives, business functions, business services, business processes, business roles, business data models, collections of organization and functions related business functions to organizational units in the form of matrix report. It also includes views corresponding to the selected viewpoints addressing the key stakeholder concerns. Continuing with the outputs of the phase B, we need to have a draft architectural requirement specification. This is a set of quantitative statements that outline what an implementation project must do in order to comply with the architecture. An architectural requirement specification, we can mention things such as gap analysis result, technical requirements to identify, categorizing and prioritizing the implications for work in remaining architectural domains. Also, to update the business requirements. Next output is business architecture components of an architectural roadmap. This lists individual work packets that will realize the target architecture and lays them out on a timeline to show progress from the baseline architecture to the target architecture. The outputs may include some or all of the following catalogs as well that I've listed here. So we just go through this quickly. Organizational actor catalog. I mentioned these catalogs before as well, so it's not really a big concern. So we need the matrices, and also we need diagrams that I've already mentioned. Thank you for listening.